Hi, it's Ian here, survivor of many Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing edition wars over the years. And what I'm going to do is talk today about nostalgia and how that is a marketing tool at the moment for various companies and to various levels of success. First, before we get into all of that, we need to work out where the idea of an adventure or a module came from. And originally, the only adventures that were around back in the mid-70s were those that they published inside the rule books and the supplements to them that were meant as examples for Dungeon Masters. The thought at the time was that players wouldn't want to have another company coming in and pushing their adventures on their worlds or whatever. They had their worlds, the creators, Guy Jackson Arneson and so on, they had their own worlds and their own adventures that they would play in their own campaigns. And it was felt that these wouldn't be of any interest to anyone outside. So although there were supplements, there was a supplement called Greyhawk, there was a supplement called Blackmore, these largely just contained ideas from their campaigns, but not much information or any information about the worlds themselves. Blackmore supplement itself had an example adventure in there called the Temple of the Frog. Now this was largely seen as the first published adventure, although it was published as an example dungeon inside a supplement, and that was published back in 1975. So the first published adventure we get is in 1975, but not as a standalone adventure produced for the game. And with all that being said, so the mindset of TSR themselves in there going, well, no one's going to be interested in these products. A company called Judges Guild approached them with the idea of getting a license to publish supplements, campaign supplements and rulebooks and adventures for the D&D game. Prior to that, there was a couple of other adventures that had been published. In 1976, you had Palace of the Vampire Queen and the first versions of the Lost Caverns of Choscanth. Now these things were published as competition modules or as part of conventions things. They weren't sort of properly published or widely distributed. They were just present for those that had taken part in those tournaments or were in those particular clubs that could get hold of those. So really it was the Judges Guild ones that were the first properly published and distributed. Most famous amongst those at the start was in 1977 was the adventure Tegel Manor. Now that was a sprawling haunted house type adventure, and has lasted through to today, as we'll see later. So it wasn't until 1978 that TSR themselves got on the adventure writing, publishing bandwagon after seeing other companies doing it so successful, mostly Judges Guild, pushing together these adventures and people were actually buying them. So in 1978 TSR decided that this was a game that they wanted to get involved in. And it did so by publishing the first of the Giant series of modules. So you had the Hall of the Steading of the Hill Giant King, the Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl, and Halls of the Fire Giant King. They were all published at that time. Steading of the Hill Giant Chief, wasn't it, not King? So those three adventures, G1, 2 and 3, were published in 1978, and they were followed on by the D series and so on. Now, you can tell that Guy Jackson at the time was writing these adventures in parallel with the rule books at the same time. So adventure writing was something that he did in between putting the rule books together for advanced D&D. So with the Monster Barrel coming out in 1977, that was really a revamp of all the stats and cleaning up of those from the original versions of D&D. When it came to the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, that was a complete overhaul of the game. And you can see the new monsters that were in in the G&D series of adventures came into the Dungeon Master's Guide. So you had Mesodemons, Nicodemons, that kind of thing. They ended up being listed in the Dungeon Master's Guide monster summary charts when they weren't actually in the monster manual. So you could tell from the way that the books were published things that were going on in tandem with each other. So that's how it all started. And then subsequently, when they started doing more in the way of introductory box sets and so on, which started in '77, they began putting sample adventures in the form of modules into those, and as well as those being example adventures, they were also meant as teaching tools to teach dungeon masters how to put adventures together and so on, and as tools in order to be published separately as well. So they weren't just like the Temple of Frog, which was published inside the pages of Blackmore, the supplement Blackmore, where you got the B1. So we got B1. It's originally published in 1979. It was put into the introductory box set for Dungeons and Dragons, and also sold separately. So this was a separate product that was also included in the box sets. And as you can see, there's the whole scope of that. This is pretty much an almost empty dungeon, where you've got blank entries for the Dungeon Master to write in, and a whole load of charts and tables and advice on how to actually populate the adventure. So it was really a teaching tool to go through. And B1 was eventually taken over by B2. Like me, you ended up with just copy upon copy of this thing, and it was a similar kind of idea. It was included in the box sets after B1 was sort of retired from being included in the box sets. B2 took over, and again, it's a teaching tool. There are lots of advice on how to play. There's lots of sort of suggestions, lots of blank areas in the map in order to be completed. And this is my played copy of it. It's just scribbled on for To Kingdom Come. This is a bit of a cleaner copy of things here, but again, I had a bit of a habit at one point of making everything loose leaf. But so that's really the adventures. You had the original Giant series, and you had the B series that started in as introductory adventures in order to teach people the game. So that's really where the modules really started off, as just included in rule books in order for them to give examples of what they meant by a dungeon for the people that hadn't picked up the game before at all, and then going on as seeing other companies doing well with their own adventures like Tegel Manor, to publishing their own sets while in between writing the rule books for games, and then on to actually publishing standalone products in order to introduce the game, teach the game, and also sell adventures to people. So that was the start. Now, B1 and B2 we've covered. They're both pretty standard. I think one of the things they tried to do with adventures, I think, is quite good, is to not have published adventures as being, here is a dungeon, go and crawl around it, because anyone can do adventures like that. When people start going on about mega dungeons and everything, what you really need to do is to sketch a bunch of square rooms or different shaped rooms onto a map and join them all together, and you've got yourself a mega dungeon. It's not an art. I mean, you've got modules like or adventures in recent years that are trying to go back on the nostalgia of the idea of huge sprawling dungeons. it wasn't something that people did. It was people did do it, but the maps for most of the dungeons that we had were just, you know, in UK A4 size or US letter size, whatever. You'd draw something on that, and that would be your level. Maybe two side by side would form it. Not some massive poster type thing, but yeah, some people did that, but I think the vast majority of people didn't. And as you can see, you know, they did the difference between these two. I think B1 is a bit of a more sort of traditional layout. I don't want to show you any of the maps and things, so I'm trying to be a bit cagey about that, so don't spoil them if you do decide to play them. But the idea, each panel there is the size of one of the levels of the maps. What they did with B2 was they introduced the idea of a steading where the players could go and rest up and have their own little intriguing adventures there, and an adventure location somewhere else where they could go. Do it piecemeal as well. The intriguing thing there wasn't so much a dungeon in levels, it was lots of mini dungeons, and so the players could go explore one of the mini dungeons, come back to the eponymous keep, rest up, do what they needed to there, and then as they got further on into the adventure, there were all sorts of other little plots that they could get involved in that were largely left for the DM to flesh out. And that's one of the important things of the old modules, even the G series of modules, you know, where they were actually publishing them as standalone things, was that by and large they were left for DMs to flesh out themselves. We'll come through all the way through this theme of this review. So even when Keep on the Borderlands was republished as part of the Silver Anniversary, they fleshed some of it out. They made the maps prettier. They fleshed some of the hinted at plots that were in the original. Gave some more meat on the bones there. But you know, they kept most of the elements of it. I think they gave there is some teaching advice in there about actually fitting it in and fleshing it out and building things and how to actually play. So yeah, there's still a tool for learning the game. But as you can see, they have firmly said it now in the world of Greyhawk. So following on from those, the next important one that everyone ended up getting was X1. So this one is another bit of a sandbox thing, another bit of a teaching tool where they're saying they give you some examples about dealing with adventures outdoors. So they Keep on the Borderlands and In Search of the Unknown, largely about dungeons and the generalities of play. And X1 gave you here's how to handle wilderness adventures. So it was a teaching module as well, a bit more of advanced teaching module. Was put into what was termed at the time the expert set. So you had the basic set, which took you up to level 3, and then you got the expert set that came out, which took you up to level 14. So and then there was later on they introduced more and more. I think most people actually fell for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons instead, because you didn't have to wait for the next rule set to get to the next set of levels. You sort of went, they diddled themselves out with a bit of marketing there. It wasn't until the mid-80s where the companion set came out that you had anything above level 14, whereas in the Dungeons & Dragons books from the Player's Handbook in 78 on, you had any level you wanted to. The rules were there, laid out for you. You didn't have to wait for the next set. So I think they did something wrong there, but be what it may. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people went to AD&D rather than D&D, but that's a separate issue. So again, sandbox thing, pretty much giving you an island to play with here, lots of different locations within the island. Now they've actually introduced a campaign setting of such into this. So you got your first look at bits of the known world that later became known as Mystara. That was introduced a little bit into the expert rules, hinted at in the basic rules, or the later version of the basic rules. So X1 gave you a bit of more of a picture of a wider world, and there was nothing in the Isle of Dread that made you play that world. It was, again, like B1, where they're giving you an example dungeon to fill out, and in B2 they're just giving you a very rough overview of the wilderness and then guiding you into how you might use that. In X1, that map of the world was really illustrating, here's what we can do with the world, and encouraging you to go on and to do your own thing. So nothing was really nailed down to any master or anything. They were really just giving you examples of what can be done with the game and with wilderness island dungeons and so on. So that was the Isle of Dread. X1, standalone product again, included in the expert rules box set, and another good sort of little teaching tool. And if you look at these adventures, I mean, collectively, what we've got, I've got 3 copies of 1. We're still pretty much, not quite up to my knuckle yet. I'll show you why that's important when we get to it. And then, like I said, one of the things they tried to do with each adventure, they tried to do something different. So we've got, a basic dungeon, then we've got little mini dungeons in a small campaign set area with a base, and then we've got a whole wilderness with lots of different locations to explore and how to manage a wilderness thing. And then with this one, which was 1980, first versions of this tournament scenario for Origins 2. Okay. So they tried to do something different again. So this added in some science fiction themes to it. There was a reason for that as well, which I will cover when we actually get to the reproduction of this. But lots of maps came. A double gatefold of maps, and also an illustration book. So it wasn't the first adventure that came out with an illustration book. The Tomb of Horrors had one before this, and this too. No, White Blue Mountain didn't, but the Tomb of Horrors certainly had an illustration book. My badly crayoned in pictures from when I was a kid, but so you got 2 booklets with this, an illustration book and the adventure book itself. A whole bunch of maps to it. But again, this had some details on Greyhawk. It said, if you're playing it in Greyhawk, then it can be here. There we go. They started including these. If you're using Greyhawk, then it's in this location. And there was some sort of mention, it's of place names and so on. But none of these were fixed. The worlds weren't so detailed as you didn't have to spend hours extracting all of those world-specific details out in order to replace those with your own. These things were very sort of generic and so on, so that you could replace any of the dimensions of the world rather than anything mechanical, rules-based or specific in there. So, Expedition to the Barrier Peak. It's kind of one of my favourites. It's a bit of a weird one, and it tends to confuse players to start with. But once they get into the idea of it, it's a good one to run them through. And the last one for this particular section, of the original adventures sort of thing, I want you to take a look at is this one. So this is B4, Lost City. Now the whole reason behind B4, or the whole difference behind B4, is that you had a little kind of civilization floating around. It was a basic dungeon adventure, but you had the civilization that inhabited the dungeon, that split into factions, and the players could interact with factions. So it wasn't just a case of this room, kill the monsters, nick the treasure, it was also it introduced the idea of interacting with things. And the last levels of bits of this were left very much for the DM to flesh out, and the very lower levels of it, again, I'm trying to cage around what's actually in there. But they've got a section expanding the adventure, so the last bit, so you got the very basics of the dungeon itself. The first few levels very detailed. The further down you get, the less detail there is there. It's assuming that the DM is going to fill in the gaps and detail things out a bit. And then when you get down to the very, very bottom, I think there's a map and a couple of paragraphs on what you might do with it. Yeah, so a couple of pages on here are some ideas. You can go through. Here's a map, and here's some ideas on how you might want to use it to carry on the adventure there. So very much a sort of, detailed standard adventure. But what makes it different from the others is the scope that they allow, the room that they allow the DM at the end of it to go and play, the sandbox that they've got at the bottom. So those 4 adventures form the basis for these 4 tomes here. Now these are published by Goodman Games, and I think we'll go into some of the other conversions of modules that have come out relatively in recent years, especially since the advent of 5th edition D&D, and get into the sort of nostalgia cells and different directions that's gone in. But let me put my flag to the mast and say that these are the sort of the best, I think, of the converted modules out there. They're quite pricey, but you do get quite a lot. So the first one they published was this one. So Into the Borderlands, these do two things on the whole. The first of is act as a historical document. So inside the pages here, you'll find lots of interviews and things. If the authors and whatnot are still alive of the original adventures, they've tried to get hold of those authors and interview them. But otherwise, they've interviewed people that are involved in one way or another. And some of those give interesting insights into how the modules are going through and how they develop them and what ideas are floating around with them. The next section of it, so we're talking about this far in. The next bit of it is a whole section where they're going and giving you facsimiles of the original adventures. So we can go up to this is facsimile of the first printing of In Search of the Unknown. Then you've got a sort of facsimile of the second printing of In Search of the Unknown. But it's all kind of interesting to see how things developed and the thinking behind putting these adventures together, because they're relatively new at this. It's like a couple of years into them actually putting adventures together. Then they've introduced some nice little examples of how they would have done it these days. A couple of here's how we would have what adventures and chests and things that we would have put in. Then some various publications of different versions of B2. So again, the first edition and second edition of that. So this goes on to the second edition. And that takes us quite a way in. They do include all of these things. These things we used to cut out the back, the reference charts for the games, that the rules that weren't actually included in the thing. And to draw your own map, blank piece of paper. Yeah, so that takes us up to this, about half the book. I think there's about 2 or 3 different printings, and they're not just the same thing over and over again. There are differences between each printing that are quite interesting to look back in a sort of retrospective kind of way. No colour pages in this one, but there are colour plates at the back where you've got the original cover art to the various adventures. There's B2, the original sort of lovely green coloured B1, and the more coloured cover of B1. So you have got the colour covers in here as well. And then from there on in, the rest of that half of the dungeon, they have put together a 5th edition conversion. Now, one of the things they say of these books is conversion and classic homage. So the homage bit is that first section where there are actually interviews and facsimiles of the original adventures and some commentary on them. And then the conversion forms the second half of the book, where they've converted things over, added some bits and pieces in, and converted everything to 5th edition. And one of the things that they have done, where the originals let you flesh things out, left a lot blank, the conversions have filled a lot of those blanks in. Now, I don't mind that to a certain extent in some of these, but especially in the ones that were really left as blank canvases, on it with the Isle of Dread and the Lost City, it's a bit jarring. Where the originals were saying, here is some examples of what you might do, and here's a rough overview of how you might take this. What the Goodman conversions have done is they've taken that, run with it, and filled those blanks in for you. I don't necessarily think that's the best idea of the way they've gone. However, it does form some examples of what you might do yourself. So you could take those dangling points of the originals, and the originals are in here, so you can see what advice they gave you from that Goodman, the authors at Goodman, were working from in order to produce their fill in the gap sections. And you can take those, use the Goodman ones as examples, and alter them and come up with your own ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you could run with the Goodman ones. I'm not saying that the gap fillers, the fleshing out bits that Goodman have done are bad. In fact, some of the ideas in here and in the Isle of Dread ones are really, really good. So you can mix and match, and you can do what you want. I think the fact that the original modules are in here, that will help you and guide you in what you may want to do with the conversion versions, or you could just run the conversion one straight. But as a book, it combines the two together. There was a space in the B2 Wilderness map to put B1, so it makes logical sense for them to go into the same book together. And it's they've done a really good thing. So if you're into a more sort of location-led, more sort of think on your fly, more sort of flesh things out as you go kind of adventure for low level and an introduction into role-playing in D&D, this, I think, is better than anything Wizard of the Coast or whatever have pulled out along that line. They did a similar treatment for the Isle of Dread. So, in this case, you have got the colour covers, you have got interviews, you have got facsimile of the original adventure, you have got 2 of those, I think, in this case, when they recovered stuff in the early 80s, 81, 82, I think it was. They came up with this coloured band across the top, and they recovered things to be like that, but they also did a reformat of the page layout, So you've got this more of a three column idea going. So they've facsimile of that too, and that takes us up again, pretty much similar to the original, roughly halfway. Because we're only dealing with a single module here, so obviously it doesn't take that far up. But so all the rest of this is their conversion of the adventure. Now, what I'd have to say is that is the conversion of the adventure, and that is new monsters, magical items, and so on that they've had to convert as well in order to make the game work. Now, X1 did have a lot of new monsters in it from the book, away from the rule book themselves. So it is actually quite logical that there would be a fairly large new monster section on that. But one of the things they have done is they've converted and added in and converted a lot of monsters from earlier editions of D&D that weren't in the adventure anyway, because they've done the similar thing again, and they've fleshed out the bits and pieces that were left for DMs to do in the original. But again, it's not bad. There's some very good ideas in there, and because you have the originals there, you can make a decision, an informed decision, whether to use them as they're written, or to change them, or to use them as inspiration, or whatever. It's really up to you, but they give you a lot of material. The next one they did, Volume 3. Ooh. Now, before we crack into it, the first criticism I have with this is square spined, whereas all the others, or the first two, sorry, have got a rounded spine. So they don't look right on the shelf, but that's just my OCD playing up. It doesn't really make any difference to what's inside there. And again, we've got some this art is just new. Good old Errol Otis weird stuff. But we do have similar kind of things. So we have the original art. The paper stock that this is printed on is a lot better quality. I think they're finding their feet in the way that they're putting these books together. So we have interviews again. Then we come into the facsimile of the original adventure. Now, what they do with this, it gets a bit. So we've got that's the original printing. Then we have maps for it. Then we have the handout booklet is reproduced. Then we have another printing where we've got the adventure. We have the maps, and where we have the illustration book. And I'm not sure that's quite the best use of space. I think there are some differences between the illustrations between the two editions. So I suppose in order to have a true facsimile reproduction, they would have to include the booklets twice in order to do that. But I think they could have saved themselves a bit more space to do things with if they had maybe been a bit wiser about how that, instead of producing everything straight. But it is what it is. They're going for faithful facsimiles and reproductions of these things, so they would have had to do it. And then again, this is the conversion. So we've got a similar kind of affair with this as we do with X1. In fact, because of the space-based, science fiction-based thing, there were a lot of new monsters and new concepts in this. So this is the conversion, and this similar thickness is the new monsters and new bits and pieces again. But what they've done maps. What they've done, this section here is the illustrations again. Now, it seems that there is a very, very large chunk, basically that times 3, of this book that is given from reproducing pretty much the same illustrations 3 times. Now, I think they would have probably been better by referring back to the original illustrations, maybe, to say, you know, use the original illustration booklet section of the module for this, rather than reproduce the whole thing again. But again, they're going for the sort of complete facsimile idea, experience, whatever you want to call it. So it makes sense in a way, and there are some new illustrations in this, but it makes sense in a way for them to have done this separately. But to my mind, it does seem to be a bit of a wasted space in the book. And the maps, the maps are kind of copied of the originals, but they are in a lot of cases, because it's quite a large area involved, quite a large, can get a little bit difficult to read and things. So the way they have actually redone the maps, they are very, very helpful. They're more helpful than the original maps in the adventure. One of the things that I quite like as well is they've left it right to the end. They've given a little bit of an overview of Metamorphosis Alpha. And the speculation at the time, because in the first edition of Dungeon Master's Guide they included conversions for various other games that TSR were pulling out, including Metamorphosis Alpha and Boot Hill, a cowboy western game. When this module came out, when Expeditions of Barrow Pigs came out, there was a tendency to think that, oh, maybe this is part of the spaceship from Metamorphosis Alpha or something like that. And reading through this, it does actually say that yes, this was intended originally played as an adventure for Metamorphosis Alpha, and then was then converted over into being a D&D adventure later on. So that was quite a bit of information I didn't know. It was nice to read it. But it's a little appendix right at the back of the book that just goes into its history in that way. And the fourth one that's not long been out now, again with a square spine rather than a rounded spine. So that seems to be the direction they've gone with this all. Although, you know, ribbon bookmarks are always nice. So, The Lost City. And inside, again, facsimiles, interviews, bits and pieces. The interview with Harold Johnson is actually quite fun to read. The facsimile of the covers and the original adventure. That takes us up to facsimile of the colour-banded cover. But that's as far as they go. There's only one version of the module published in both covers, but only one copy of the text. So we get into their conversion of the module fairly earlier on than we do in any of the others, and so you can see the disparity there. Whereas the others are about 50-50 original and interviews and then the conversion. This one is that much of the interviews in the original facsimile, and then this much, which is all their conversion material. So fair chunk. And this is broken down. So that's maps. Then they've included some illustration handouts, a few pages of those. Then they've included quite a lot. So conversions of magical items and monsters. Another good section of those, including some interesting things. Like the Thule was a monster that really turned up all over the place in basic adventures, and now 5th edition stats for it. So if you're a fan of Thules from back in the day, there you go. They're in here, and then that is the conversion of the module. And if we take it on actual conversion, that section here of the book is the actual conversion of the original material from the Lost City module, and then them fleshing things out and adding in the bits that were hinted at but missing from the original, and encouraging DMs to go and fill in the gaps themselves, is all of that. It's about a quarter the size bigger, or at least the same block again. And they have virtually fleshed everything out. It's quite some read, and again, it's good material. I would have rather them have maybe just included some notes or something on how to flesh it out. But I'm not unhappy that they did all that fleshing out. I just think it's a bit of a sign of the times, where current authors feel that this is what they need to do. They need to leave the readers, and I think in certain cases a lot of DMs, current DMs if you like, are expecting everything to be given to them. If they want to play an adventure, they want to be able to pick that adventure up, read it once, and have everything they need to go off. Whereas some of the things that we had in the oldie days fired our imaginations more, where we had to try and work out how things would fit into the particular campaigns that we were playing, with the characters of the players that we had, and fill in the gaps, if you like. And there's some modules that were meant to run together to form a big story arc, where there's so many continuity errors in those, and you could either flesh over the continuity errors and change them to suit what was going on, or you could try and work out reasons for those continuity errors to have existed, and write those into the adventure code. So there's a lot of work. And if you look on top modules of D&D, some of these old modules that were very bare bones and very left open to the DMs to fill in themselves, a lot of those end up in the top ranking on these best modules ever. And I'm pretty sure that's why. Is because those adventures were left to the DMs to make of them what they will, and because of that, because it felt more like their adventure and it suited them more and whatever, that's why they end up being voted high. There's people going, oh yeah, we remember playing that one and it was really good. Was it really good because it was written to be really good, or was it really good because it gave you enough space to develop your own material into it, to make it yours, give you the kernel of an idea and then let you loose on it? And in some ways, I think that side of adventure writing, the give you that idea and let you go, is lost these days. Which kind of brings me. So they're the 4 Goodman conversions that have been done. Bit of a comparison back to their originals, and I think they're really good. I'd recommend them. They're not cheap, but then again, what role-playing game book is cheap these days? They do fill in gaps that I don't think they should have, but the way they filled those gaps in is good, and will be very useful to people, especially DMs that want that sort of concepts going on. So what I want to do next is kind of show the difference between the conversions that have been that Goodman have done, and the conversions that have been done of original adventures in an official capacity, so by Wizards of the Coast. So they've done 2 so far. First one I'm going to talk about because the second one is a bit contentious. So the first one is actually the first modules that were published by TSR UK, or written by adventure writers in the UK. So they're kind of quite more, me being a Brit, they kind of talk to me more, especially in the spelling that they use in terms of colour, and in terms of the general themes that they go on. There is definitely, if you read the UK written modules, there is definitely a UK style of adventure that's not quite the same as the US style of adventure. It's not that either one is worse than the other. You could be given a module that you didn't know, and read it through, and you could take a good guess at whether it was a US or a UK writer that had put that together. And this is actually one of my favourite series. So the Saltmarsh series, it's a continuous escalation sort of thing. So you've got a first to third level basic module with some advice on how to run, and a little bit kind of haunted house, little bits going on, introduces you to the setting and stuff. Then things escalate a bit more. The levels. It says 1 to 4, but yeah, I think definitely over second. So things have gone on a bit more, and they introduces them a little bit into the wilderness and some of the power factions at play, and off they go and solve that. And then the last one, 3rd to 5th level, very much the thicker of the bunch. Let's just go 48 pages, whereas that's 32. I think that one's 32 too. Yeah, 32. 30. That's an interesting page count. But yeah, so this one goes to 48. Quite a more extensive dungeon. Some pretty coloured pictures and some handouts. And yeah, very much a more involved and dangerous mission they go on. So it's a nice series to play. Played it several times, and is actually one of my favourite series. So Wizards of the Coast, they converted it over, and if you imagine all I've said about the Goodman conversions filling in blanks for DMs, you might understand why I'm not happy about these ones at all. So what they've done, and what most of the Wizards of the Coast adventures go like, they've given you a story, and they've said, and here are the various crescendo points in that story, list of encounters, whatever, and they feel like you take characters, put them into one situation, then guide them to the next one, and run them through that, and then guide them to the next one. So instead of being, here's a location and a rough plot about what's going on in the outside, we're going to describe the location and then leave it up to you as to how you're going to leave it up to the players to see which way they want to attack the plot. They go, here's the plot, now fit your players into it. So I think they're nice books, the maps are pretty, but there's too much in here. There is too much in the way of guidance and a certain amount of railroading and a certain amount of, here is the plot, fit your players into it. And although it goes for any adventure or even rules, if they don't suit your players, then change anything you like. But the amount to fit this, even with all its gap filling, to fit that into my own campaign would take me next to no time. To fit that in would take me ages, because I would have to unpick everything that didn't fit. And there's new monsters is great. Always appreciate new monsters. But then they come into new factions. They come into just bits and pieces that are very specific to the environment that they're describing, because they want to include them, and they've made the environment include them. This one isn't one of the worst ones. Some of the worst ones include, specific characters that have been built through certain new classes or new features for classes or whatever. And those may not necessarily fit your campaign, so if you're going to run it, you have to push them out. They're interesting books to read. They're nice. They're nicely put together, but they've gone too far in what they've done. And the same goes. So this is a huge bugbear of mine. So this is one of the often really, really highly ranked D&D adventures of ever, and for good reason. It is effectively Dracula for D&D, and it is good. I've played it again lots of times. It's one of the few modules that I've actually played instead of DM'd as well, and they are rare and few and far in between. In fact, the only two I can remember off the top of my head are this one and Palace of the Silver Princess. But it's good. It's one of the first ones that introduced isometric maps in, and also the adventure is easily plugged in. It starts off by saying your players are in a pub, and this stuff happens, and off they can go. They're given a message, and they try and go, and the mists close around them, and they are trapped in this thing, and they have to try and find their way out, and they get involved in other plots and stuff that are hinted at and sort of described and sort of put together, but are largely left for the DM to explore with his players. Now, one of the problems with this poor thing being one of the most popular modules going out there is that it was republished for as a anniversary edition for second edition. It was republished again as another anniversary edition, converted straight over to third edition. Then it was given we want to write a massive volume on it and add all sorts of plot elements to it and add lots of new things to it and make it into one of these, we're giving you the plot and here are the plot points that you need to carry on, take your players to as you're going, type of affairs for later on near the end of third edition. And then damn me if they didn't do it again. So it's sort of, and there's not, they don't add enough to it all. This is let's take the original adventure. Let's go and they took some of the stuff from here, from the third edition one, but by and large it's a completely new thing. Let's go and add some prettiness to it, and I don't care if an adventure is pretty. If an adventure is pretty, if an adventure isn't pretty, then it will stand. If it's bad and it's pretty, then what are you going to do? Buy it for the art? You buy an adventure for the adventure. Now again, this isn't a bad thing. This isn't a bad adventure, but it is. Here's a plot. Fit your adventures into it, and it is expanded out beyond anything that would be necessary for it. But this seems to be what people want. It seems to be the way people think that adventure should be. It should be. We're going to give you everything. Everything that you need to run a massive campaign that once upon a time was I can't remember, was it 32 pages originally? Was it a 32 or was it a 48? Yeah, so originally a 32-page adventure that was good for a reason, that is so highly recommended and finds itself at the top of the module chart for a reason. It's not bad. It gives you enough material to go and wrap your head around it and to really put your players through the mill on it. These are, both of them, there's effectively no difference between the concept of either of those. They are, here's a series of plot points, take your players through. So, I'm disappointed by the adventures that Wizards of the Coast have pulled out. They are far too glossy and far too here's everything, hand everything on the plate to the players. Not much. The only imagination really is what's on at the table. And I think this one was actually. Did they introduce a load of new bits and pieces? This might be been one of those that escaped it. So magic items. Yeah. No. No, there isn't. So I think it goes a bit insane. And they did. There was a Kickstarter a while back where they published Tegel Manor. I thought would go way back to the original solo product published, distributed adventure. And yes, sort of Tegel Manor has been redone with pretty maps. But what they've done with this is a little bit different to the way Wizards of the Coast done. Wizards of the Coast have republished these modules and converted them over and added a ton of plot to them and take you through the plot. What they've really done with Tegel Manor here is they have converted the module over, added a few more bits and pieces to expand out on some of the locations on the wilderness map, and then just sort of left you to your own devices. More conversions of monsters and spells and so on, which actually take up quite a lot, and then description of the characters, the NPCs involved, and then a whole bunch of new stuff. So, but the new stuff they've added is just going through the module. It's thicker, a lot thicker than the original, but there were no game stats in the original by and large. It was mainly descriptions of rooms and stuff. So, all the game stat blocks were a lot smaller. So they've expanded it, but they haven't given you a lead you by the hand plot overview that you are just meant to take your characters through point by point as they go. So, in my opinion, this is a much better conversion of an old classic than the way they have when Wizards of the Coast have been going with their conversions over. So, unfortunately, for various reasons, I'm not sure you can get this now anymore, but there are issues surrounding Judges Guild at the moment. They've been taken down from Drive-Thru RPG and a number of other things for various things that happened at the beginning of this year. I won't go into them. You can look them up if you really want to find why aren't Judges Guild being published on Drive-Thru at the moment. But there you go. So, speaking of Drive-Thru RPG, one of the things that's really good. A lot of these old modules are now available. Obviously, virtually every edition of D&D is now available in PDF or in hardcover form as print on demand from Drive-Thru RPG. So it's quite nice when you've got an old, battered, falling apart, cut up version of a module that you've had for years and have played so many times. This has got to be definitely within my top 5 adventures, D&D adventures of all time. Probably top 3, maybe even top on some days. But it's nice to be able to go and get a nice clean copy on print on demand on Drive-Thru RPG, and the facsimiles they do. They're really good scans that they're doing for some of them. So they've even taken the time to be able to split the maps across the folds instead of some of the reproductions I've seen, some of the print-on-demand stuff I've seen, where they've actually had to staple the maps inside the book. They've stapled them across a fold, and you lose the middle section of the map, which is a terrible thing to do. But they're good for that, and a lot of my old favourite modules that have just been used for decades, over and over and over again, and are falling apart at the seams. It's been nice to get, nice clean copies that aren't falling apart. And the reason why, not just because it's just one of my favourites, the reason why is because I'm excited for what Goodman have involved for us next. Volume 5 of their classic adventures has been slated to redo Castle Amber. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's meant to be out in October. And then after that is quite a big one. I'm going to be interested to see how they do this, but the Temple of Elemental Evil, that is currently slated to be their 6th classic adventure to convert and do the homage for. So it'd be interesting to see when it goes through, because this is one that Guy Jack started that had to give up on various reasons, and Frank Menster took over and completed it. So it'd be interesting to see the commentary on Guy Jack is obviously no longer with us, but I believe Frank Menster still is, so it'd be I hope there's an interview with him about it. So yeah, these are 2. That's probably in my top 5 too. So Goodman appear to be tracking along the lines of my favourite modules of all time. So anyway, that's a bit of a review of sorts, and an overview of how the nostalgia, how various companies are picking up on the old adventures and running with them for 5th edition, and my thoughts on them. General summary: the Goodman Games are great. They give you the facsimile of the original adventure. They flesh them out in ways that I don't think were necessary to do so. In some cases, the reproductions go a bit over the top, especially in S3, where you've got the illustration booklet reprinted 3 or 4 times. But the ways that they have fleshed them out, even though I don't think they're necessary, they are done in a very good way. They still leave the adventures relatively clean, so that if you do want to put them into any campaign world, really easy to do that. Everything you pretty much need to read to run those games is there, as well as some interesting tidbits from behind the scenes from those authors that are still living, and various people that were involved in editing or writing them or managing the TSR back in the day. And a rough overview of my general thoughts of the way that Wizards of the Coast and other companies have handled doing the similar thing. So it is a bit hit and miss. Some of you might enjoy that sort of more railroady, plot-driven, everything given to you to run with approach to things. Not my cup of tea, really. I much prefer having work to do to be able to put things into my own particular campaign setting. What I don't enjoy doing is having to unpick what someone else has put in to make it specific to a campaign setting to start with. The more I have to unpick of someone else's work, the more frustrated I get with an adventure. So I'd rather put my energies and effort into putting things into it to make it fit with my setting, whichever setting I use, be it published one or my own, rather than having to take things out and then rebalance the whole story. And I certainly don't like plot-driven things. I think it started with Dragonlance, so fan of the books, really like the books, easy to read, switch your mind off, read something generically fantasy. Don't like the adventures. The adventures just sit there and lead the characters through the nose through a plot that has already been laid out before them. And that seems to be the way that the Wizards of the Coast modules now, Wizards of the Coast adventures work these days. So it's not having to go at the people that wrote them, because the writing is really good and the books are really good. And if you like that sort of thing, and if you like Dragonlance, you'll like what's going on with the way that these adventures are put together. If you are more of a mind to like tinkering with things and throwing things around and using worlds other than those that the things have been intended for, then probably won't get on with them. But you will get on with the Goodman ones. So that's my thoughts. So thank you for watching.